Friday the 13th is often dismissed as folklore, a date inflated by superstition and repetition. Within the Annabelle case, however, the date was never treated symbolically. It was treated procedurally. Investigators did not fear Friday the 13th as a source of power. They regarded it as a convergence point, a moment where patterns historically intensified, not because of belief, but because of conditions that reliably repeated themselves. Annabelle was never touched on this date for reasons that had nothing to do with ritual and everything to do with discipline. The restriction did not appear suddenly. It emerged gradually through accumulated observation. Over time, investigators noticed that attempts to access, relocate, or even formally inspect Annabelle on specific calendar alignments produced a disproportionate number of secondary complications. These complications were not dramatic. They were logistical, environmental, and psychological. Equipment failures occurred without mechanical explanation. Personnel reported heightened agitation. Decision-making became erratic. None of these issues alone justified concern. Together they formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Friday the 13th stood out not because something extraordinary always happened, but because minor deviations clustered consistently around it. Investigators learned early that clusters mattered more than incidents. A single anomaly could be dismissed. Repeated anomalies occurring under the same conditions demanded restriction. The date became one of those conditions. Not sacred, not cursed, simply unreliable. One of the most critical misunderstandings about the Annabelle case is the assumption that contact was always dramatic. In reality, contact was often mundane. Moving the enclosure, cleaning the environment, conducting routine checks. These actions were procedural, not exploratory. Yet even these minimal interactions showed variation when performed on certain dates. Friday the 13th produced enough variation to justify exclusion. When stability depends on consistency, variability becomes risk. Investigators emphasized that Annabelle did not respond to attention emotionally. She responded structurally. Changes in routine, environment, and human behavior altered conditions. Friday the 13th introduced variability at every one of those levels. Staff rotations changed. External attention increased. Cultural awareness of the date subtly altered posture, even among skeptics. These shifts were not intentional, but they were measurable. Annabelle's case had already demonstrated sensitivity to minimal engagement. There was no reason to introduce additional variables voluntarily. Another factor was precedent. Historical review revealed that several early escalation points aligned with dates of heightened external attention. Friday the 13th repeatedly coincided with increased visitor curiosity, informal discussion, and relaxed skepticism. Investigators recognized this as a compounding risk. The date did not create danger. It amplified exposure. Exposure had always been the critical variable. The decision to prohibit contact on Friday the 13th was therefore administrative, not symbolic. It was documented alongside other restrictions tied to staffing changes, relocation attempts, and environmental modification. Over time, it became standardized. The language used was deliberate. Not forbidden, but restricted. Not dangerous, but unstable. The objective was clarity, not fear. Importantly, this restriction applied even when no activity had been observed for extended periods. Investigators rejected the logic that calm justified flexibility. Calm had preceded escalation before. The absence of incident did not erase pattern recognition. Friday the 13th remained a date associated with unnecessary variability. Removing access on that date cost nothing and reduced risk. In risk management, such decisions are straightforward. There was also an internal behavioral reason for the rule. Humans behave differently when they know a date carries cultural meaning. Even those who reject superstition unconsciously adjust tone, humor, and attention. Investigators understood that Annabelle's case did not require belief to respond. It required behavior. Any shift in behavior mattered. Friday the 13th guaranteed subtle shifts. Restriction eliminated them. Another overlooked aspect was documentation bias. Events that occurred on culturally significant dates were more likely to be remembered, discussed, and reinterpreted. This retrospective focus could distort assessment and invite renewed curiosity. By eliminating interaction on Friday the 13th entirely, investigators removed the possibility of future reinterpretation tied to the date. Nothing could be misremembered if nothing occurred. The rule also served a training function. New personnel learned early that Annabelle was governed by procedure, not impulse. Restrictions like the Friday the 13th prohibition reinforced that framework. The message was implicit. If a rule exists without dramatic justification, it exists because something was learned the hard way. Questions were discouraged. Compliance was expected. Over time, the restriction proved effective. No escalation occurred on Friday the 13th because no interaction occurred. This outcome was not interpreted as proof of superstition. It was interpreted as confirmation of discipline. Stability followed restraint, exactly as the case history predicted. The rule remained because it worked. Understanding why Annabelle is never touched on Friday the 13th requires abandoning the idea that the date itself matters. What mattered was predictability. Friday the 13th consistently disrupted it. The Annabelle case had already shown that predictability was safety. Any condition that undermined it, however subtly, was removed. This first phase establishes a critical point. The restriction exists not because investigators feared what might happen, but because they understood what already had. Annabelle's case was shaped by patterns, not symbols. Friday the 13th was one of those patterns. The next part will examine how this rule was formalized, what happened the last time it was questioned, and why investigators concluded that even testing the restriction was unnecessary risk. The rule itself did not begin as a written prohibition. Like most constraints in the Annabelle case, it emerged informally before it was codified. Investigators noticed that whenever Friday the 13th approached, discussions about the case increased, even internally. Jokes surfaced, comparisons were made, external references bled into professional language. None of this appeared dangerous on its own, yet the cumulative effect was unmistakable. Attention increased. Attention had always been the catalyst. The simplest way to interrupt that cycle was to remove the option of interaction entirely. At first, the restriction was situational. Contact was postponed rather than prohibited. Routine checks were rescheduled. Maintenance was moved forward or delayed. This flexibility worked temporarily, but it introduced negotiation into a system that required rigidity. Each postponement prompted the same question: why not just proceed as normal? Investigators recognized that once a rule invites debate, it weakens. Debate is engagement. Engagement changes conditions. The Annabelle case had already demonstrated this too clearly to ignore. The moment that formalized the rule came during an internal review of near-miss events. None of these events involved dramatic manifestations. They involved errors in judgment, a checklist completed out of order, a door left unsecured longer than usual, a discussion that drifted into speculation. When these incidents were mapped chronologically, a pattern emerged. They clustered around periods of heightened contextual noise. Friday the 13th consistently coincided with that noise. The date did not cause mistakes. It increased the likelihood of them. Investigators concluded that the system could not rely on perfect behavior under imperfect conditions. The purpose of protocol is to compensate for human variability, not to demand its elimination. Friday the 13th introduced variables that could not be controlled directly: external attention, cultural framing, altered schedules. The only controllable response was restriction. If no one interacted with Annabelle on that date, none of those variables could converge around her. Once the rule was written, its wording was intentionally neutral. There was no mention of superstition, danger, or heightened risk. The language was operational. No direct or indirect contact with the object or enclosure on designated dates associated with increased external attention. Friday the 13th was listed alongside other conditions, such as unscheduled access requests or environmental disruption. This framing mattered. It kept the rule grounded in procedure rather than myth. The first challenge to the rule did not come from disbelief, but from efficiency. A scheduled inspection conflicted with the date. Delaying it would have required minor logistical adjustments. Proceeding would have saved time. Investigators debated the cost-benefit briefly, then rejected the comparison outright. Time saved had never justified risk introduced. The Annabelle case had taught that convenience was often the pretext for exposure. The inspection was postponed. Nothing happened. That outcome reinforced the rule rather than undermining it. Importantly, nothing dramatic ever happened when the rule was followed. This absence of consequence sometimes led newer personnel to question its necessity. Investigators anticipated this reaction. They emphasized that the rule existed precisely to ensure nothing happened. Success was invisible by design. The Annabelle case had repeatedly shown that waiting for confirmation before enforcing restraint was backwards. Restraint came first. Confirmation followed through stability. Another reason the rule remained untested was historical memory. Investigators were acutely aware of how earlier rules in the case had been relaxed under the assumption that conditions had changed. Each relaxation preceded escalation. The Friday the 13th restriction was therefore treated as non-negotiable. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was simple. Simple rules endure. Complex exceptions invite error. The rule also served as a diagnostic boundary. If someone felt compelled to question it, that compulsion itself was treated as data. Why did the rule feel excessive? What assumptions were being made about safety? Investigators recognized that resistance often signaled normalization. Normalization had always preceded exposure. The rule thus functioned as both barrier and indicator. Over time, the restriction became routine. Friday the 13th passed without incident because it passed without interaction. The absence of events did not diminish the rule's importance. It clarified it. The Annabelle case had never required proof through escalation. It required proof through consistency. The rule delivered that consistency. The most important aspect of the restriction is that it never stood alone. It was part of a broader framework designed to eliminate unnecessary variables. Friday the 13th was not unique. It was representative. It demonstrated how external context could influence internal behavior, even when no one intended it to. By removing interaction on that date, investigators removed a predictable source of distortion. This second phase makes one thing clear. The rule exists not because investigators feared a specific outcome, but because they refused to gamble on predictability. The Annabelle case had already shown the cost of small gambles. Friday the 13th was simply one more condition where restraint proved cheaper than correction. The final part will examine why investigators never attempted to test the rule deliberately, why nothing happening was considered sufficient evidence, and why some restrictions are only effective when they are never challenged. What ultimately prevented the Friday the 13th restriction from ever being tested was not fear, but a hard-earned understanding of how fragile stability actually was. Investigators had learned through repeated experience that rules only invite testing when people believe the system can tolerate it. In the Annabelle case, tolerance had never been demonstrated. The system responded to minimal deviation. Testing a rule whose sole purpose was to remove deviation would have introduced the very condition it was designed to prevent. From a procedural standpoint, the idea of testing it was irrational. This realization reframed how evidence was defined. In most investigations, evidence is produced by action. Something is done, and the result is observed. In the Annabelle case, evidence accumulated through inaction. Every Friday the 13th that passed without interaction and without incident reinforced the same conclusion. Restraint preserved equilibrium. Investigators accepted that this was sufficient. They did not require escalation to validate a hypothesis that had already been confirmed indirectly multiple times. Another reason the rule was never tested lies in the asymmetry of risk. If investigators followed the restriction and nothing happened, the outcome was neutral. If they violated it and something happened, the cost could be permanent. The potential downside far outweighed any informational gain. Investigators are trained to avoid experiments with irreversible outcomes. The Annabelle case presented no scenario in which violating the rule would produce a benefit proportional to the risk. Under such conditions, testing is not inquiry. It is negligence. The culture surrounding the case also played a role. Over time, Annabelle became associated not with mystery, but with discipline. New personnel were not encouraged to understand her. They were instructed to maintain conditions. This cultural framing discouraged experimentation. Curiosity was not punished, but it was redirected. Questions were answered with reference to outcomes rather than explanations. The message was consistent. The system works because it is not challenged. Investigators also recognized that testing the rule would contaminate interpretation. Any event occurring on a Friday the 13th after interaction would be impossible to evaluate cleanly. Was the response due to the date, the interaction, the attention surrounding the test, or the anticipation of outcome? The system had already demonstrated sensitivity to all of these variables. Introducing them simultaneously would produce ambiguous data at best. Ambiguity had already delayed recognition earlier in the case. There was no reason to repeat that mistake. Another factor was institutional memory of prior harmless tests. In earlier phases of the case, small experiments had been conducted with the intention of clarifying boundaries. Each one introduced instability disproportionate to its scale. Investigators learned that the system did not reward precision testing. It punished it. This history made the idea of deliberately violating a preventative rule untenable. The lesson was clear. Boundaries existed because the cost of crossing them had already been paid. The Friday the 13th restriction also endured because it was easy to follow. Effective rules require minimal effort. They do not rely on constant judgment calls. They remove choice entirely. On that date, nothing happened. No decisions were required. No discretion was exercised. This simplicity reduced the likelihood of error. Investigators understood that complex protocols fail under pressure. Simple ones persist. There was also a psychological advantage to the rule's rigidity. When a restriction is absolute, it stops inviting justification. There is no need to argue whether conditions are safe enough. The decision has already been made. This removed a significant cognitive burden from caretakers. Cognitive load had previously contributed to mistakes. The rule reduced it. Over time, the absence of incidents on Friday the 13th became normalized internally, but never trivialized. Investigators were careful to frame the outcome correctly. Nothing happened because nothing was done. This distinction was reinforced repeatedly in training and documentation. The silence was not evidence of superstition. It was evidence of effective constraint. The rule also served as a reference point for evaluating other potential restrictions. Investigators compared outcomes before and after similar prohibitions were introduced in other contexts. The results were consistent. Removing optional interaction reduced variability. Reduced variability increased stability. The Friday the 13th rule became a model rather than an exception. One of the most revealing aspects of this phase is that external observers often misinterpreted the restriction as symbolic. Internally, it was understood as mechanical. It functioned like shutting down a system during known periods of interference. No one argued that turning off sensitive equipment during electrical storms was superstition. The logic was the same. Friday the 13th represented a predictable increase in contextual interference. Shutting down interaction was the rational response. Investigators also acknowledged that even discussing the rule externally could introduce risk. Discussion invites speculation. Speculation invites reinterpretation. For this reason, the restriction was rarely explained beyond procedural language. It existed to be followed, not debated. This limited its exposure to narrative distortion. As years passed, the rule's persistence became self-reinforcing. Each uneventful Friday the 13th strengthened confidence in the broader framework. The Annabelle case no longer required justification through activity. It was governed by precedent. Precedent carried more weight than theory. The third phase of this story reveals a critical truth about the Annabelle case. The most effective safeguards were the ones that were never tested. Their success depended on absence, not demonstration. The desire to prove a rule unnecessary was recognized as the very impulse the rule was designed to restrain. This brings the narrative to its final implication. If a restriction works only when it is never challenged, what does that say about the nature of the system it protects against? The final part will examine why investigators concluded that some rules must remain unbroken forever, not because they are fragile, but because the system they govern is. The final reason the Friday the 13th rule remains unbroken is the same reason Annabelle remains contained at all. Some systems only remain stable when they are never challenged. Investigators eventually accepted that this was not a limitation of protocol, but a defining characteristic of the case. The Annabelle phenomenon did not need to be activated to prove it existed. It had already demonstrated its sensitivity to engagement often enough. At this stage, the absence of escalation became the strongest data point available. Over time, the rule ceased to feel exceptional and began to feel inevitable. Friday the 13th was no longer treated as a special date. It was treated as a predictable disturbance in context. External attention increased. Cultural references resurfaced. Informal discussion became unavoidable. Even without belief, posture shifted. Investigators recognized that posture, not superstition, was the real variable. When posture changes, behavior follows. When behavior follows, conditions change. The rule existed to interrupt that chain before it could begin. One of the most important conclusions drawn from this rule is that stability does not require constant reinforcement through action. It requires consistency through restraint. The Annabelle case had already shown that action, any action, created opportunity for reinterpretation. Restraint closed those openings. Friday the 13th became a fixed point of restraint precisely because it was predictable. If a disturbance can be predicted, it can be neutralized in advance. The simplest neutralization was non-engagement. Investigators also understood that breaking the rule even once would change the meaning of the rule forever. A single exception would introduce precedent. Precedent would invite repetition. Repetition would invite testing. Testing would reintroduce variables that had been deliberately removed. In systems as sensitive as Annabelle's, precedent is not neutral. It accumulates. The rule's strength lay in its absoluteness. Another critical factor was narrative contamination. The moment an interaction occurred on Friday the 13th, that interaction would become inseparable from the date in memory and retelling. Regardless of outcome, it would invite reinterpretation. If something happened, superstition would be blamed. If nothing happened, the rule would be questioned. Either outcome increased engagement. The only way to prevent narrative formation was to ensure nothing occurred at all. Silence preserved clarity. Investigators came to see the rule as part of a broader philosophy: risk management through refusal. Not every question needs an answer. Not every rule needs validation. Some boundaries exist because validation itself is hazardous. The Annabelle case forced investigators to abandon the assumption that knowledge is always beneficial. In this context, knowledge acquisition had become indistinguishable from exposure. This acceptance marked the end of experimentation entirely. Annabelle was no longer a subject of inquiry. She was a subject of maintenance. The Friday the 13th rule symbolized that transition. It drew a clear line between investigation and stewardship. Investigation asks what happens if. Stewardship asks what must never happen again. There was also a generational consideration. Future caretakers would inherit rules without memory of the original cost. The rule's simplicity ensured it could be followed without explanation. No contact on Friday the 13th required no interpretation. It did not depend on belief, fear, or understanding. It depended only on compliance. This made it durable across time, personnel changes, and cultural shifts. The rule also functioned as a test of institutional discipline. If a team could follow a rule that produced no visible outcome, it demonstrated maturity. If it could not, it revealed vulnerability. Investigators learned to measure readiness not by activity, but by the ability to refrain from it. The Annabelle case rewarded discipline, not bravery. Perhaps the most revealing conclusion of all is that nothing bad ever needed to happen on Friday the 13th for the rule to matter. The rule mattered because of what had already happened when restraint was absent. It mattered because the system had shown how easily stability could be lost. It mattered because prevention is always quieter than correction. This is why Annabelle is never touched on Friday the 13th. Not because the date holds power, but because people do. People change behavior. Behavior changes conditions. Conditions change outcomes. Investigators learned that controlling outcomes required controlling behavior, even when that behavior seemed harmless. In the end, the rule stands as a reminder of the central lesson of the Annabelle case. The most dangerous actions are often the ones that feel unnecessary. The safest decisions are often the ones that feel excessive. Friday the 13th did not demand fear. It demanded discipline. The case stabilized not when answers were found, but when questions stop being asked at the wrong time. Annabelle remains untouched on that date because touching her would satisfy curiosity at the expense of stability. And stability, once achieved, is the only outcome worth preserving. This is the conclusion investigators reached after years of observation, error, and correction. Some rules exist not to be understood, but to be obeyed. Some boundaries exist not because they will be crossed, but because crossing them would change everything. That is why the rule remains. That is why it has never been broken. And that is why, on Friday the 13th, nothing happens at all.